It's the last video on this topic. Again, just to kind of round off what I was speaking about in the last video, we end up in a situation where the Anabaptists are rebaptizing each other as adults, and they're doing this in defiance of Zwingli and Zwingli's teachings. Now, the old law code at this time that dated back before the Reformation prescribed kind of a grim parody punishment for rejecting infant baptism. That was, the punishment was drowning. You don't like baptism, well, we're going to drown you in water. And so that's the punishment that the Anabaptists face, because both Catholics and Zwinglians and Lutherans all are united in rejecting what the Anabaptists are doing. And so the Anabaptists face persecution and executions, which they mostly accept as a type of martyrdom. Now, the Anabaptists, nevertheless, despite this persecution, continue to spread across Europe. And you can see that they're spreading very much in the central corridor here. Here's Zurich, here's where Zwingli begins, but they're going to spread up north through this corridor, basically between France and Germany. In 1527, they established the Schletham Articles. And the Schletham Articles were designed to lay out the crux of the beliefs of the Anabaptists. Those beliefs were adult baptism, contingent on acts, excommunication of those who lived sinful lives, the Lord's Supper as a commemorative meal, not as an act of sacrifice, that believers should be separate from the world. So again, this is coming back to the idea that's going to become more and more important for the Anabaptists, that there should be a separate community of believers, a separate community of people who are really following the gospel, and those who don't should be excommunicated from that community. No clerical hierarchy, but shepherds chosen on the basis of living godly lives, a rejection of oaths, and a rejection of bearing weapons. Both of these are seen as participating in the world and being corrupted by the interests of the world, and so this is that's the reason behind this article. Now, what's interesting is that oaths and weapon bearing are going to be fine for the Anabaptists as long as they're being conducted in support of the community of believers. So we're about to see the Anabaptists get pretty violent, so I want to explain to you why it's not seen as a contradiction for them. And so basically these acts build towards the idea of restoring what they see as a primitive Christian church, of this community of believers that's separated from any unbelievers or anyone who's not living a godly life. Now, this comes with some challenges, as you might imagine, and we see these challenges arise in the modern-day country of Holland, in the city of Munster. Now, as you remember from the map, or as you can see on this map, this is already a pretty radical region. So Strasbourg, that's going to be another important city for Calvin. And this was where a man named Melchior Hoffman had begun to preach baptism into what he called a pure Church of Christ. And he began in the city of Strasbourg that he prophesied would be the New Jerusalem. Now, the authorities in Strasbourg didn't really want their city to be the location for the end of the world, so they imprisoned Melchior Hoffman. However, he wrote this book, and it was smuggled out of the prison before his death. It was disseminated using the printing press. It prophesied an alliance between a prophet and a ruler that would bring about the return of the Church of Christ and the saints. And we're going to see Hoffman's prophecy. We're going to see the Anabaptists try and fulfill Hoffman's prophecy in the city of Munster. The city of Munster has a very turbulent history in the Reformation. I'm going to skip back to the map again. You can see that it is right here on the edge of this area. In 1532, the bishop was expelled by the Lutherans. So you had a Catholic bishop, Catholic hierarchy, just as you had throughout the centuries of the Middle Ages. And then you have the Protestant Reformation, you have the rise of Lutheranism, and the Lutherans drive the bishop out of the city. But Catholics remain loyal to him. So he goes out into the countryside and begins assembling an army while Lutherans still control the city. Inside the city, however, a former priest who had become a Lutheran and then a Zwinglian and now a radical named Bernard Rothman began to take control. He began to make himself very powerful among the different guilds in the town, and the town council was no longer powerful enough to discipline him, and he starts promoting the teachings of Melchior Hoffman and applying them to himself. Alarmed by this, Catholics and Lutherans start to flee the city, and this leads to the Anabaptists taking control of the city council. Take control of the city council, Catholics and Lutherans flee from the city, and Anabaptist refugees start to arrive. And so the city of Munster, under the control of the Anabaptists, is going to be ruled by a man called Jan Mattes. Mattes is going to try and rule the city of Munster according to his understanding of how the primitive church was governed. Now, what's the difference here? One is a religious community, but here you have a political community. And so Mattes is basically trying to create a theocracy here. And so he says that he's going to either execute or forcibly rebaptize anyone who doesn't accept baptism. Everything is going to be held in common, so that means doors of houses had to be left open. Anyone could wander into your house and take whatever they wanted. Wives were also supposed to be held in common. And Mattes is eventually killed in a battle against the bishop's army. So while all this is going on, Mattes is trying to implement this radical theocracy. The Catholic bishop, who's made a comeback, is outside the city, laying siege to the city. And we're told that Mattes' successor, Jan Leiden, suggested to him that he might be invincible because he was the Lord's anointed. And so he went out and fought this battle, and he was killed. So now Mattes is going to be succeeded, and the Anabaptist rule of the city is going to be conducted by this man called Jan Leiden. And Leiden has himself anointed and crowned, just like a king of the Israelites in the Bible, the king of the righteous. Under his regime, sinners were executed. These were sins like blasphemy, seditious language, adultery, backbiting, and disobedience. Leiden also introduced polygamy into the city as a way of asserting male dominance, as a way of increasing the godly population, and those women who resisted were imprisoned or executed, including one of Leiden's own wives, who was trampled and beheaded. Eventually, the city was captured, and Rothman and Leiden and the other leaders were executed, and you can still see these today, these cages hung from the tower of the main church, and this was where their bodies were displayed. And so this was a way of, this was a sign to people, if you embrace Anabaptism, this is what's going to happen. This kind of theocratic, tyrannical society, and it's going to end with execution. Now, the Anabaptists themselves were shocked by some of the acts that Leiden and Mattes and Rothman had carried out. And so in the aftermath of this disaster, they decide that it is actually impossible for them to take over communities and reform them to follow God and to live godly lives. And so instead, they focus on withdrawal from the world. Instead, they say we're going to create intentional communities that do not engage with the world, where we can still have this community of the godless. And so you develop these voluntary communities, and the leader of the group that pioneers this is called Menno Simons. And his followers today become known as the Mennonites, and then also by other names like the Amish. And they create these communities of families who have agreed to live by a certain covenant that embrace pacifism and separation from the rest of the world. So that's all we're going to say about the Anabaptists. This shows you how difficult this Reformation is to control, the really radical areas that it can go, and the ultimate separation of radical Protestants kind of from mainline society.